I'm Sean Rona, and I'm the Maladroit Millennial. Episode 6, Channel Surfing. One of the things I've been wanting to do for over a year, before I decided to launch this series even, is to make a video celebrating my favorite online content creators, my favorite YouTube channels in particular. I had an episode mostly recorded about a year ago and then I abandoned it, but the videos I'm making now are so much better than the videos I made before, so I'm going to try this again using my modern style, even though I know very few people are yet interested in watching these. One of my obsessions, dating back to childhood that I rarely told anybody about, was reading criticism. I'm the kind of pretentious weirdo who likes reading criticism more than consuming the art being criticized much of the time. I think that's because I've always enjoyed non-fiction more than fiction for a variety of reasons. That's not to say there's not a lot of fiction that I like, there is. But my tastes in fiction don't really line up all that well with either the things critics slobber over or the things that attract large fandoms. I'm neither into nihilistic portraits of morally ambiguous protagonists who steadily turn into sociopaths on the one end, nor vapid comic book extravaganzas on the other end. When I was a little kid just discovering the World Wide Web circa 1995, I discovered film criticism when I first encountered Roger Ebert's movie page, which was at the time called the Roger Ebert Movie Files. At the time, he only had all his reviews back to 1985 on his site, but eventually this was expanded to encompass his whole career. While my parents were divorced, I lived with my dad in a Mattydale apartment adjacent to Roxborough Middle School, and we used to go to a lot of second-run movies at Mattydale's kind of scuzzy Hollywood theater. I mostly only went to see kids' films, family films, and a few adult middle-brow dramas at the time, but I did start looking up a lot of Ebert's reviews of those, and I guess it had a big influence on me and even my writing. I didn't watch his show with Gene Siskel at the time. I've watched a lot of clips more recently, but over the next several decades I read tons of his reviews, even for movies I knew I had no interest in even seeing. Shortly thereafter, I discovered a site called the Ultimate Band List around 1997 or 98, which was a site that attempted to aggregate links for a comprehensive list of music artists across most genres, and it frequently posted reviews from the All Music Guide, which I discovered soon after that. I almost entirely listened to classic rock radio at that time at the turn of the millennium, and I read pretty much all the reviews on All Music for every album for pretty much every major classic rock act. But I did not yet branch out much past that. I read a lot of reviews, especially by Stephen Thomas Erlewine and William Ruhlman. Right before I graduated high school, my mom bought me the Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll. It was an old version from the early 90s, and I never ended up reading most of the essays in it, but there were a couple of essays in it I read a lot, and I was instantly attracted to the writing styles of Robert Christgau and Chuck Eddy. Eddy was probably my favorite critic at that time. He was basically Christgau's chief protege, while also being the leading contrarian music critic of the 80s, as he was critical of the genres mainstream critics tended to love and defended all the genres they tended to hate. Christgau did tend to annoy me too much with his catty insults at times, but when I discovered his site I loved it, particularly because it was the first source I was able to find online that included year-by-year critics' polls of best albums and best singles for every year for decades. Around the same time, while I was in college, I was doing some weird quasi-related statistical analyses. In the early years of Facebook, you could do multi-layered searches where you could search for people based on every field of information they submitted on their profiles. For instance, you could search for users based on political affiliation, who took a certain class, favorite movies, favorite musical artists. Anything that was entered on Facebook profile was fair game for this. In retrospect, this seems very bizarre and maybe a little intrusive, but I used those data to do some of my own statistical analyses which nobody cared about. I made a series of LiveJournal posts in 2006 and 2007 where I calculated the average political affiliation by college majors for Cornell students, followed by the average political affiliation for fans of certain artists and students at certain colleges. Back in those days, students on Facebook listed their political affiliation on a 5-point scale from very liberal to very conservative. You could also select libertarian, but I threw that out because that could mean anything from Noam Chomsky to Ayn Rand, and it arguably isn't on the same axis as liberal and conservative anyway, so I simply summed up the number of people who selected each political affiliation at Cornell for each major or musical artist or whatever, awarding 0 points for very liberal and 4 points for very conservative while averaging out the results. I only included artists who sold 10 million or more albums in the United States and had 50 or more listed fans at Cornell. By that metric, the 5 artists who had the most liberal fan bases were Janis Joplin, Cat Stevens, Prince, Paul Simon, and Bob Dylan, and the 5 artists who had the most conservative fan bases were Tim McGraw, Garth Brooks, Kenny Chesney, Toby Keith, and Creed. That sounds dead on, right? But Cornell was so liberal in general that even the most conservative artists appeared around the middle of the 4-point spectrum. I thought this was interesting even if nobody else did. As for colleges, the most liberal was Brown and the most conservative was Yeshiva, and that also sounds right. However, you can tell that because my music analysis just focused on the big sellers, I was still pretty unaware of underground and alternative stuff back then, and I probably would be right until YouTube broke huge because I did not believe in file sharing and believed it was stealing for far longer than most of my peers did. I finally eventually gave in when YouTube made everything even more accessible, especially after I graduated college. I discovered acclaimedmusic.net, the site that aggregates pretty much every critics poll ever to rank the 10,000 best songs and 3,000 best albums in pop music history. At the time, they only ranked the 3,000 best songs, but I decided to listen to all the top 3,000 songs I had never heard, just so I'd be a little less ignorant about various cultural touchstones it was embarrassing I knew nothing about. I still was never enough of an album listener, so I was totally becoming the sort of pretentious pseudo-intellectual who was at least minimally informed about everything important without knowing all that much in true depth about anything, as befitting someone who liked criticism more than art. But as you can see, even though this is something I rarely talk about, it did kind of have a big influence on my life to some degree. More recently, I found TheyShootPictures.com, which ranks basically every movie ever, and TheGreatestBooks.org, which ranks thousands of books, and they certainly had influences on me too. When Michael DeRoche and I were adding thousands of quotes on Typeracer, we literally went from the top and the bottom of the top 1,000 list on They Shoot Pictures, as well as the top of the list on the greatest books, to select sources for Typeracer quotes. So this does in a minimal way tie in with all my typing stuff. Besides Ebert, Christgau, and Eddy, there were a lot of other critics of music, movies, and TV that I loved and read often, even if I wasn't into a lot of the kinds of art that a lot of those critics were into. I'm gonna shout out a bunch of my other favorite critics right here. Nathan Rabin, James Berardinelli, Emily Vanderwerf, Mark Prindle, George Starostin, John McFerrin. I read all those guys a lot, but there were many others I was into to a lesser degree. I never really got into book or video game criticism, though. As to what influence any of these people had on my own writing, I'm not sure, but there probably was some influence somewhere. So it was only natural, I guess, that I would eventually discover the wave of online critics that took off at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. One of my high school classmates got me into the nostalgia critic a little bit in his early years. Although he's become a joke and a personification of the era of the internet and YouTube that many people wish had never happened, I definitely felt he was pretty good for the first 3 years or so. But I was always of two minds with Doug Walker. Whenever he was trying to make genuine criticism, and not trying to be funny or pedantic, I thought he was pretty good. Certainly not as good as most print film critics, but I enjoyed him enough. However, I never found him funny. In fact, I found his skits and attempts at comedy as consistently and insufferably unfunny. There was something ironic and appalling about a guy who correctly called out unfunny jokes in bad comedies, yet tended to make even worse jokes in his own videos when he was making fun of them. Because television requires people to be entertaining much more than print does, as time went on he started adding more and more bad skits and increasingly taking away all the good criticism he used to do, and by the time he started making movies with the other members of his stupidly named Channel Awesome ensemble, he had largely turned to crap. But it wasn't much of a loss, as he was never my favorite critic anyway. However, I bring him up because he was clearly the chief influence on my favorite YouTuber in general. For the last 3 years or so, my favorite YouTuber on the platform has been this guy, Todd in the Shadows. He started out as a ripoff of the nostalgia critic who did reviews of usually bad pop music instead of bad movies, but he progressed far beyond Doug Walker and has become one of the most consistent YouTubers, especially in recent years. He adopted a gimmick of always concealing his face like Wilson on Home Improvement, which is definitely a great way of maintaining your anonymity despite having a very successful channel. At the start or end of most episodes, he plays a song from the single or album he is reviewing on his piano, and a lot of times his renditions sound better than the actual studio versions do. He has three main series: Todd's Pop Song Reviews, where he reviews a current mainstream pop hit; One Hit Wonderland, where he reviews a one-hit wonder from 10 or more years ago; and my favorite series, Train Records, where he takes deep dives on albums that he dubbed to be so bad that they ended careers. He's definitely gotten me into a lot of stuff, good or bad, that I wouldn't have been into otherwise. Lately, he's become more of a historian of pop music and pop culture in general than an actual critic, and I think that's where his best work lies, analyzing how current or historical music fit into the cultural zeitgeist. His stuff is very similar to the stuff VH1 used to do, like Behind the Music, their career narrative series, or Pop-Up Video, where they unearthed factoids related to whatever song they were playing. But VH1 has abandoned most of their old music programming, so he really is fitting an unfilled niche here. Although I know very few of my subscribers are into these Maladroit Millennial videos, he's definitely been a big influence on them. While I do think he's a gifted writer, a good pianist, and he's good at splicing clips together, he doesn't have particularly great technical skills in terms of cinematography, making his own clips, and filming himself. He was one of the people who convinced me, hey, maybe I can do this, and inspired me to attempt more professional videos. He's a big influence on me, and I've watched almost everything he's ever released multiple times, sometimes many more. I also like that he doesn't require specific definitions for what he covers. In his One Hit Wonderland series, for instance, he includes anything that feels like a one-hit wonder to him, regardless of how many hits the artist actually had. There are some acts like Aha, Falco, Hanson, and Blue Swede who actually had multiple major hits, but most people only remember the one. There are other acts like the Grateful Dead, Oasis, Rush, even Jimi Hendrix, who actually only had one top 40 hit in America, but no one on earth would call them one-hit wonders because they certainly had multiple important songs that got a lot of radio airplay. Best of all, even though the Nostalgia Critic was clearly Todd's main influence, his jokes are consistently funny while Doug's were consistently putrid. For example, let me share my favorite clip from Todd in the Shadows. A few years ago, the rapper Logic released a ballad to raise awareness of suicide, but handled it so ineptly that it came off as trivializing it. Although I am not proud of it, I admit I laughed hard at this.
All my ladies with suicidal depression say hey! And all my fellas who have self-endangering mood disorder say ho! When I say self, you say harm!
There are some other critics I like too. I also really enjoyed Diamond X Studios, a YouTuber who also has some published science fiction books I've never read. He's basically just a Todd in the Shadows ripoff, but he does have better production values and is sometimes more insightful. However, his videos are also more repetitive and less entertaining. He tends to review the same songs over and over too much, but his best work, especially his top 10 best and worst song lists from various years, are excellent. Very recently I discovered Cinematic Excrement, who does the Nostalgia Critic shtick, but way better. He's funnier with better production values and better writing, but far fewer subscribers I guess because he just emerged too late. In the past couple years I've also been really enjoying Jose, who takes deep hour-long dives of TV shows, mostly 80s and 90s sitcoms from my youth. His main content tends to bore me. He's a socialist and most of his videos are calling out stupid things conservative pundits say, which I find just as boring as Ben Shapiro owning some college student or whatever. But his TV criticism is great. Most of our culture writers act like television started with The Simpsons and The Sopranos and everything prior to that is dismissible. So it is interesting to watch Jose's videos on things like Murphy Brown that had a huge impact on culture at the time, but have next to none in retrospect. For the higher brows among you, the best channel I've found in that regard is Manufacturing Intellect. It's such a pretentiously pompous and annoying name for a channel, no doubt, but the content is great. These guys have unearthed all sorts of obscure TV interviews not available anywhere else for many of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, including authors, poets, critics, architects, directors, screenwriters, political activists, musicians, and many others. I probably only watched 10 or 15 of these and they have over 1,000, but someday I may get around to watching all of this channel. From the little I have seen, I highly recommend it. If you're too lazy to read or watch these artists' works, this is probably the next best thing. I particularly like this interview of David Foster Wallace, Jonathan Franzen, and Mark Lehner, three of the most acclaimed authors of the 90s. Although Wallace was an obnoxious jerkwad and not someone I admire as a person, I must admit he was a great writer and an important influence on my book.
I was raised to view television as more or less my main kind of artistic snorkel to the universe.
Unfortunately, it was hosted by Charlie Rose.
Your books are known to be, this book is known to be complicated and long, compared even to the internet.
On the more mundane end, I've been really enjoying Syracuse Nostalgia, which has been aggregating clips from various newscasts, commercials, concerts, and dying malls from across my hometown area. Like I said several times in my previous videos, as I've gotten older I've been getting increasingly lonely and really seeking out local connections more. I support any YouTube channel that archives a lot of stuff from the 80s and 90s that was on television but was never properly archived anywhere, and that's pretty much most newscasts, talk shows, interview shows, news magazines, and nonfiction material on TV in general. I also support any channel that attempts to get people thinking about their local communities again, albeit in some modest way, and Syracuse Nostalgia does a great job of both. I'm sure I'll never watch all the videos on this channel, but I'm glad it exists. It makes me sad that my own channel is almost twice as big because I think his is better. The guy who made this channel also went to my high school about a decade before I did, and I've talked to him a couple of times. He has some footage of my high school from some guy who got kicked out of one of his classes and decided to film all the school. Ah, the memories. Although it was probably my biggest interest for most of my adult life, even more than typing, I haven't made any videos totally devoted to auto racing yet, but those are coming eventually. I have read and watched and written so much auto racing content over the years, for the most part I just watched archives of past races, either for my own amusement or to conduct statistical analyses on auto racing history. But there are a handful of explicitly auto racing channels I wanted to give shoutouts to as well. Over the past 3 years or so, I have been chatting most frequently in a Discord with a group of auto racing fans, primarily NASCAR fans, who are mostly 10 to 15 years younger than me. We started out posting on the comments sections on racingreference.info, the site that my former auto racing archive racedatabase.com was competing against. As a result, we were much more statistically and analytically oriented fans than most other NASCAR fans, and a bunch of the other members started a podcast that appeared both on YouTube and on Spotify called the TRC Podcast. Last week I appeared on it discussing my history as an auto racing fan and analyst, as well as discussing a lot of the statistics I invented both on Race Database and the spin-off site I later launched, Racer Metrics. This is now the third podcast I've been on, and I probably like it more than the other two. Here you can hear me speaking on it. I was a Dale Earnhardt fan initially for the stupidest reason, because he finished third in that race and drove the 3 car. I'm not kidding. I was 9 years old, and even less mature than that, because I was a special ed kid in elementary school while also being this borderline child prodigy at the same time, which was very weird. There are 4 other auto racing channels I admire a lot. Slapshoes makes narrative-driven documentaries about various aspects of NASCAR history, and his production values are way better than those of most YouTube amateurs such as myself. He also has a great voice for narration, and his stuff could really air on television and you wouldn't notice the difference. I personally like how mellow and low-key he is when too many of the actual NASCAR announcers overdo it with their bombast and failed attempts at humor. I disagree with a number of the things he says, but he's probably one of the best auto racing historians on the platform. In one of his other videos on one of his other channels, he also discussed how he taught himself to make videos, assemble clips, and so on, particularly discussing how to best make content using clips from other people's videos while making sure that it is still fair use. He taught me a great deal and was an important influence on my own videos. In the same vein, I also like NASCAR Man's historical videos. While Slapshoes is more emotional and opinionated because his NASCAR videos have more of an artistic aspiration, NASCAR Man's videos are more plain-spoken and objective documentaries about various aspects of auto racing history. Slapshoes is more entertaining, but I think NASCAR Man is probably more informative because he dug up a lot of obscure footage from racing interview shows and old news clippings, and honestly that might have had an influence on me too, because so many of my recent videos have consisted largely of screenshots from archived news clippings. The Scene Vault is a channel that collects interviews with famous people from NASCAR history, but because it was associated with NASCAR Winston Cup Scene, a now defunct magazine, they mostly interviewed drivers, car owners, and other figures who were big on the NASCAR scene 20 to 30 years ago, but have long since left the racing business. As a result, this channel gives you a lot of deep dives on long ago racing history, including transactions that weren't covered much in the racing media at the time. Since most of the people they interview are no longer involved in racing, they tend to be far more outspoken than people you see in the racing media today, who face considerably more restraints to not say what they actually think. It's an interesting perspective, and since I am old enough to remember a lot of these figures from the very early years I was watching racing when I was a kid, I enjoy these interviews a lot. Finally, the last auto racing guy I want to give a shout out to is Eric Estep. He's the most popular of these racing content creators, probably because his videos most resemble those of a gamer's. He does live streams of himself at a microphone surrounded by various racing swag, puts out a lot of content, and basically is the leader of the NASCAR YouTube community. He also hosts a podcast with several of the other main NASCAR YouTube personalities. Slapshoes has appeared on it. I wish he'd invite me on someday, but I might be slightly too old for that crowd. And periodically he does live trivia contests on NASCAR history on his channel. I participated in several of those, and that was what gave me the idea to make my own video on typing history trivia. Of course, typing history is far more obscure, and that was before I released my book or even put out any videos on typing history, so I understand why that one didn't take off, but I've got to give him credit for directly inspiring one of my own videos, even though I probably like the other 4 creators I mentioned better. My other main hobby for most of my adulthood, besides auto racing and typing, was competing in Scrabble tournaments. There really isn't a great deal of good Scrabble YouTube content out there. Matt Canick was pretty good, posting uncut recordings of his games where he discussed his thought processes in how he determined the plays he made. Here he is playing me. But for the most part, Scrabble is boring to watch, probably even more boring to watch than typing is since the games are longer. And this is me, a former tournament Scrabble player, saying this, so there have been very few Scrabble creators that I found to be truly compelling. However, I must give a shout out to Kenji Matsumoto. He is arguably the best North American Scrabble player in history who has never won the National Scrabble Championship, although he did finish second in 2011. A few years after that, he self-published a couple of strategy books, Breaking the Game and Words of Wisdom, and they were the best I ever read, including the books by the past champions Joe Edley and Joel Wapnick, which were made more for beginners. Matsumoto's book was the first to really make me understand board dynamics and how to twist the geometry of the board in your favor and stifle your opponent likewise. Almost immediately after I figured this out, I won my one Scrabble tournament in Webster, New York in 2015. I don't want to play Scrabble anymore, but if you are personally into it, I do want to give his channel a boost. As you can see here, most of what I watch has nothing to do with typing channels, primarily because most of my fans enjoyed typing a lot more than I ever did. For the most part, I just use YouTube to listen to music in the background when I'm doing something else. However, the typing YouTuber scene, which barely existed beyond me, even as recently as 5 years ago, has really taken off, and there are 3 users whose channels I really wanted to boost. Chances are, if you are following me, you're probably already following them anyway, but I still want to do this for the record, since a summary of my favorite channels would not be complete without discussing the typosphere. My favorite typing creator is Mark Bacon, who just overtook me in YouTube subscribers in the past week, but I don't mind. His content is better than mine. A recent college graduate at NYU, he creates all sorts of videos on a wide range of topics. I connect with him very deeply, as he is most famous as a typist and typing instructor, but like me, it doesn't seem to be what he actually most enjoys doing. I first discovered him when I was looking up information on last year's Keymash Championship, which I didn't participate in. And later I found his LinkedIn page where he linked a video about whether typing fast is actually useful. I confirmed with him that it wasn't. You might have seen this. Anyway, we had an extremely long conversation in the comments section of that video and several others, as well as a bunch of emails, and I decided to send him a copy of my book right after I published it. He makes videos on a staggering array of topics. Although his typing videos tend to do the best, he is also an astonishingly prolific reader, reading and reviewing something like 4 books almost every month, something I have never in my life come even close to doing. He also makes videos on teaching himself Japanese, teaching himself programming, philosophical videos, instructional videos, motivational videos, and many more. He also probably has the highest production values of any of the typing YouTubers I've seen, and the best thumbnails as well. He's only in his early 20s and he's already a pro. This stuff could air on television, but it never would because he's too smart for that. With his proud uber nerd image, his perennial closing reminders to stay awesome, and his overwrought ambition to seemingly attempt to make videos spanning the gamut across a large array of endeavors and disciplines, he feels to me like a Zoomer John Green. And although everybody makes fun of Green, and I understand why, I do generally like his books and his videos, so I definitely intend this as praise. Before I discovered Mark, my favorite YouTuber was Titanium Tendons, who has changed his username on YouTube several times. As you may recall, I nominated him for Commentator of the Year in the Typey Awards, and he quickly noticed and made a video about it. Unfortunately, a couple years ago, he deleted most of his best videos and a lot of them were never restored. He made great historical videos about the typing scene in general, and a lot of those are now lost, while since his return, he's mostly focused on exclusively Nitro-type videos, which never interested me as much, since Nitro-type was never my favorite site. But the dude has talent. And finally, the third and final typing YouTuber I'd like to give a shout out to is Speed Typing. He sort of combines the strengths of Mark and Tendons in a single channel. He has great production values with catchy thumbnails and scene transitions just like Mark, but like Tendons, he almost entirely devotes himself to typing content. Like me and Tendons, he was one of the few others who really made videos about typing history, which sadly didn't get as much traction as I hoped they would, since I find that stuff much more interesting than either current stuff or instructional stuff, although I do intend to make all those sorts of videos myself eventually. Speed Typing was one of the first people to talk about monkey type when it launched, was maybe the first to profile typing as an e-sport, and he ranked the fastest overall typist in bursters just like you'd see on a sports analytics channel or something. I figure he's just about to start college soon, so he probably would be way too busy to keep making content at the same rate and the same quality that he was, but I definitely still recommend his channel. So there you have it, a list of all the people I like to watch across many disciplines of YouTube. Now that my channel is gaining a little traction, I want to help a lot of others. For my next video, I will discuss my appearance on the Syracuse ABC affiliate News Channel 9's Morning Show. After that, I will finally make another typing video wherein I summarize the history of typing computer games from the early 80s to today. This video is not brought to you by Jake Paul. England is not my city. Say, why did somebody actually quote that on Type Racer?